Welcome to this comprehensive course on business analysis, where we will bridge the gap between complex technical systems and evolving business needs. You are about to embark on a structured journey that will transform how you perceive, define, and deliver business value. This content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional, legal, or industry certification advice. While this course references the IBA Guide, it is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to the International Institute of Business Analysis, IBA. In this opening chapter, we will establish the foundational landscape of the modern business analyst role within any organization. We will begin by exploring the critical competencies required to thrive in this position, such as advanced critical thinking, structured problem solving, and the delicate art of relationship management. By mastering these core skills, you will position yourself as the vital link that ensures technical teams and business stakeholders are always pulling in the same direction. We will provide a roadmap for your learning journey, moving from initial project discovery through to final implementation and beyond. This foundational start is essential for anyone aiming to translate abstract business desires into actionable, concrete technical requirements. The value proposition of a business analyst is anchored in your ability to mitigate project risk while ensuring that every delivered feature aligns perfectly with overarching strategic corporate goals. Throughout this course, we will examine the professional standards set forth by the IBA Guide, providing you with a gold standard for conducting analysis. We will also dissect the evolving nature of the analyst's role as it shifts between traditional waterfall projects and modern, fast-paced agile environments. You will learn to cultivate the analytical mindset required to perform effective requirements engineering regardless of the underlying development methodology. By the end of this curriculum, you'll understand how to foster consensus among disparate teams, turning potential project friction into cohesive progress. I look forward to our work together throughout the coming sections of this course. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the critical process of defining strategic objectives to ensure your analytics work directly supports the long-term vision of your organization. If you have ever felt that your projects are disconnected from the broader corporate strategy, this chapter is designed specifically for you. We are going to move beyond simple task management and elevate your role to a strategic partner who understands how to shape the future of a business. By mastering these techniques, you will transition from a mere note-taker into a professional whose analysis directly influences executive decision-making. You will learn to parse vague leadership mandates and turn them into concrete plans that deliver measurable value. This is the cornerstone of high-impact business analysis, and gaining mastery here will significantly distinguish your career from that of your peers. At the highest level of an organization, strategic objectives are not merely lists of tasks, but are the fundamental expressions of where a company intends to compete and how it intends to win. As an analyst, your primary responsibility is to bridge the gap between abstract executive desires and the granular reality of project implementation. Often, a leader might state a desire to increase market share or improve operational efficiency, but these high-level mandates lack the necessary detail to guide a development team. Your objective is not to follow these vague instructions blindly, but to decompose them into tangible, actionable roadmaps that clearly define success. This process requires you to constantly look upward toward the corporate vision and downward toward the operational capabilities currently in place. One of the most effective ways to ground your analysis is through the application of value chain analysis, which allows you to inspect every activity a company performs to create value. By breaking down the organization into primary and support activities, you identify exactly where the strategic goals might be met or where they are currently being hindered. For example, if the strategic goal is to lead the market in product innovation, Your value chain analysis might reveal that the research and development phase is bottlenecked by outdated procurement processes. You are searching for the specific touchpoints where the strategy meets the daily labor of the staff. This analytical rigor ensures that when you propose a solution, it is not simply a good idea, but a necessary step toward executing the broader business strategy. Competitive positioning is another essential dimension of this work, as your projects never exist in a vacuum separated from the external market. You must constantly evaluate how your proposed initiatives influence the company's standing relative to its competitors. If a strategic objective suggests a new digital service offering, your role is to analyze whether this move creates an actual competitive advantage or merely replicates a baseline industry feature. This involves looking at the unique selling propositions that the organization claims to hold and testing them against the evidence found in the operational data. Without this layer of analysis, you risk building systems that are functional but ultimately irrelevant to the company's ability to maintain a sustainable market presence. Translating these strategic mandates into roadmaps requires a disciplined approach to documentation and communication. You should establish a clear causal link between every feature you propose and the specific strategic objective it intends to satisfy. When you present an idea to stakeholders, do not describe it as a technical requirement or a simple feature request. Instead, frame it as a component of a strategic roadmap, explicitly explaining how it contributes to the corporate vision. By adopting this language, you change the nature of your interactions with stakeholders, shifting the conversation from cost and effort toward value and alignment. This disciplined focus on the why rather than just the what is the defining characteristic of a senior-level business analyst. Throughout this process, you must maintain a healthy skepticism regarding the initial objectives provided to you by leadership. Strategic goals are often aspirational, and an analyst's role is to stress test these goals against the current reality of the organization's resources and technical debt. You are the person who ensures that the strategy is grounded in what is actually achievable within the constraints of your specific value chain. If an objective appears misaligned with the company's core strengths, you must identify this mismatch early rather than waiting until the implementation phase to discover that the strategy was flawed. This proactive identification of risk is a vital service you provide to your team, preventing wasted time and resources. Ultimately, the mastery of strategic alignment transforms how you carry out every subsequent phase of your project. If the foundation of your requirement gathering is built on a clear, well-vetted strategic mandate, the rest of your analysis will naturally follow a coherent trajectory. You will find that defining requirements becomes easier because you have a metric to measure against. Does this requirement serve the strategy or not? This focus provides you with a definitive filter to eliminate scope creep and maintain alignment, even as the project environment shifts. Always remember that your value as an analyst is tied to the success of the business strategy you are helping to execute. See you in the next analysis session. Welcome back to our exploration of strategic planning, where we will now shift our focus toward the practical application of the SWOT framework. In this lesson, we will dissect the 4 quadrants of this model to ensure your business analysis remains grounded in reality rather than conjecture. When we approach a SWOT analysis, we are essentially performing a structured diagnostic of an organization's current state. Strengths and weaknesses are internally focused, representing the attributes that the organization directly controls, such as proprietary technology, operational efficiencies, or talent density. It is vital to remain objective here, as the human tendency toward optimism can easily inflate perceived strengths or mask critical vulnerabilities. When documenting these, I prefer to rely on verifiable data points like financial ratios, employee retention rates, or cycle times. If you cannot produce evidence to support a strength, treat it as a hypothesis that requires further validation before it can be considered a reliable foundation for your strategy. Similarly, weaknesses must be cataloged without judgment, focusing on systemic gaps in capabilities or resources that could inhibit your project goals. External factors constitute the other half of the matrix, specifically opportunities and threats, which exist independently of the organization's current activities. Opportunities are the environmental trends, market shifts, or regulatory changes that could be exploited to provide a competitive advantage if the timing is correct. Threats are the inverse, representing volatile market conditions, aggressive competitor actions, or economic downturns that pose a risk to the ongoing viability of the business. The difficulty here lies in distinguishing between a general market trend and an actual opportunity for your specific intervention. Mapping these environmental factors necessitates an understanding of the broader industry context, which requires active research and synthesis of market data. By aligning these external realities with internal capacities, you transition from simple observation to actionable strategic planning. Brainstorming sessions intended to populate this framework require a facilitator who can navigate cognitive biases and groupthink effectively. Start by establishing a common language for the participants, ensuring that everyone understands the distinction between what is internal and what is truly external. I find that using silent brainstorming techniques, where individuals write down their ideas before social pressure can influence them, leads to a more comprehensive set of inputs. Once the brainstorming is complete, you must verify the qualitative data through independent cross-referencing. If the team suggests that a lack of resources is a weakness, verify this against actual budget utilization reports rather than anecdotes. This validation step is precisely what separates a superficial list from a robust business case that stakeholders can trust. The true efficacy of SWOT analysis is realized when you transform the resulting matrix into concrete risk mitigation and strategy development efforts. When you layer your identified threats over your verified internal weaknesses, you have effectively mapped the areas of maximum exposure for your project. This exercise should directly inform your contingency planning, as it highlights where the project is most likely to fail due to external pressure. Conversely, matching strengths to opportunities allows you to prioritize the initiatives that offer the highest return on investment with the lowest level of friction. Use these insights to draft the strategic objectives portion of your business case, ensuring that every proposed solution addresses a validated truth from your analysis. A well-constructed SWOT output acts as a compass, guiding you through project feasibility assessments and ensuring that your recommendations are always anchored by rigorous inquiry. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will master the techniques of market and competitor research to ground our strategic decision-making in hard evidence. To understand the environment in which our business operates, we must objectively evaluate both the broader market landscape and the specific actions of our competitors. When we start the discovery phase, it is tempting to focus inward on internal pain points, but we risk missing significant market shifts that render our solutions obsolete before they are even built. Industry benchmarks provide a yardstick for performance, allowing us to determine if a specific requirement is a standard expectation or a unique competitive advantage. By observing how competitors position their products, we can identify gaps that represent latent demand or underserved segments. This systematic external scanning ensures that our business requirements are not merely opinions, but are instead shaped by forces beyond the organization's walls. Data-driven decision-making begins here, because without an accurate picture of the market, we are essentially guessing about the value our solution will provide. We look for patterns in competitor feature sets, their pricing models, and their messaging strategies to see where they fail to address the needs of their user base. This rigorous research prevents us from building a well-engineered solution that ultimately fails to gain traction because the market context was ignored. One of the most effective frameworks for performing a macro-environmental scan is pestle analysis, which forces us to look beyond immediate competitors and examine the external factors that dictate success. This acronym stands for political, economic, sociological, technological, legal, and environmental factors, providing a structured way to evaluate the world around us. In the political dimension, we assess how government policies or trade regulations might impact our supply chain or project feasibility. Economic factors include interest rates, inflation, or shifts in disposable income that dictate consumer willingness to adopt new products. Sociological shifts involve changing demographics or lifestyle trends that might dictate how users interact with our systems. Technological advancements often act as a double-edged sword, potentially threatening our business model while simultaneously offering new ways for us to reach our stakeholders. Legal factors impose hard boundaries on our requirements, such as data privacy regulations like GDPR or industry-specific compliance mandates. Finally, environmental sustainability is increasingly a baseline requirement rather than an optional feature, as users and regulators alike demand transparency in operational impact. Data-driven decision-making is the natural outcome of merging these techniques, ensuring that every requirement we elicit has an empirical basis. When we document our findings, we must be careful to distinguish between direct competitor features and actual industry benchmarks, as the former might be a fluke of market positioning while the latter represents a structural market necessity. If we identify that all top-performing competitors offer a particular integration, we can frame that as a necessity for market entry. Conversely, if no player in the market has successfully implemented a specific feature, we need to determine if it is due to lack of demand or a technical barrier. Our role as analysts is to curate this noise into actionable strategy, filtering out biases and focusing on the trends that have the highest probability of influencing long-term success. By the time we begin gathering requirements for specific features, we should already have a clear argument for why those features are essential, underpinned by our research. This reduces the friction during requirement prioritization, as stakeholders can intuitively see how our proposed solution aligns with the realities of the current market. Without this discipline, we are prone to repeating common mistakes or ignoring early indicators of disruption that occur outside our direct awareness. I will see you in our next session. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the mechanics of gap analysis, which serves as the bridge between your current operational reality and your desired strategic targets. Gap analysis is essentially an exercise in comparing two states of operation within an organization. We start by establishing the as-is state, which represents the current infrastructure, existing processes, and the tangible performance metrics of the business. You must be rigorous here. If you fail to accurately characterize the present, the entire comparison becomes an exercise in wishful thinking rather than professional analysis. Once the current baseline is established, we contrast it against the to-be state, which is the envisioned future where strategic objectives are fully met. The gap is not merely a performance problem, but a specific deficit of capability, technology, or workflow that prevents the organization from moving forward. When you perform this comparison, you're looking for the precise delta between where you are and where you intend to be. This analytical work requires a sober, evidence-based approach to ensure you are not merely guessing at the reasons for underperformance. By framing the missing elements clearly, you provide stakeholders with a concrete path toward transformation. Identifying these missing capabilities requires a systematic breakdown of the functional and structural requirements that define your future state. If your goal is to reduce customer churn by 15%, you might identify missing data analytics integration as a primary technical gap. Simultaneously, you may identify a process gap where the support team lacks the requisite authority to initiate expedited resolutions for high-value accounts. Each of these findings must be categorized according to its nature, whether it is a deficiency in personnel training, a limitation in existing software architecture, or perhaps a misalignment in organizational policy. As you document these gaps, you should remain objective and focused exclusively on the requirements necessary to support the strategic target. It is helpful to visualize this as a mapping exercise where you overlay the requirements of the high-level strategy onto the reality of your current operational constraints. The documented gaps become the raw material from which you will eventually derive your specific project requirements. Once you have cataloged the gaps, the focus shifts to prioritization, as treating every deficiency with equal urgency is a common pitfall that leads to resource dilution. Not every gap carries the same weight regarding its impact on the overarching business strategy. Some gaps may be critical blockers that prevent any progress, while others might be incremental improvements that can be scheduled for a later phase of the project. You should categorize these gaps based on quantitative impact, risk mitigation, and alignment with the primary strategic goals established during your earlier planning sessions. By weighting these priorities, you create a logical order for the bridge solutions that will close those gaps. This approach allows you to present management with a tiered strategy, showing them exactly what needs to be implemented first to realize the most significant strategic gains. Remember that your role is to provide the intelligence that allows leadership to make an informed decision on where to allocate their limited capital and time. Documentation of these findings is where your technical proficiency as a business analyst truly becomes visible. Each identified gap requires a clear description, evidence of the current state, a target state metric, and a justification for why the delta must be closed. Without this transparency, stakeholders may view your proposed solutions as arbitrary or potentially unnecessary additions to the project scope. When you write these delta requirements, utilize precise language that avoids ambiguous descriptors like improved efficiency or better communication. Instead, express the requirement in terms of measurable operational shifts, such as reducing the average response time from 4 hours to 30 minutes. By standardizing this format, you ensure that the development teams and project stakeholders speak the same language when it comes to implementation. A well-constructed gap analysis document acts as the definitive reference point for the entire project lifecycle, ensuring that the team remains tethered to the original strategic intent. I suggest you spend some time reflecting on how these techniques fit into your current projects. See you in our next discussion. Welcome to the chapter on root cause analysis tools. In this set of lessons, we will explore how to dissect complex business problems to uncover their true origins rather than merely fixing the symptoms. When a system fails or a project falls short of its strategic objectives, our human tendency is to address the immediate frustration. A stakeholder states that a report is incorrect, so we fix the specific data point in that report. However, this reactionary approach often results in a cycle of repetitive fixes, where the same errors reappear week after week. As analysts, our role is to act as investigators who look past the surface noise to identify the systemic process failure. By utilizing structured reasoning tools, we move away from speculative troubleshooting and toward data-driven, permanent resolutions. This shift in perspective is the hallmark of a senior professional who understands that the cost of poor quality is often rooted in unexamined process assumptions. Perhaps the most intuitive tool at our disposal is the 5 Whys, a method developed by Sakichi Toyota. The mechanics are simple. You observe a problem and ask why it occurred, and then you take the answer to that question and ask why again. You repeat this sequence 5 times, or until you reach a point where the answer describes a systemic vulnerability rather than a person or a single instance. For example, if a deployment fails, we might ask why the code crashed before realizing it was because of a missing configuration file. We then ask why the configuration was missing, leading us to find a gap in the automated build pipeline. The goal is to drill down into the infrastructure or process layer because those are the only areas where you can implement a sustainable safeguard. When a problem is multifaceted, relying on a linear sequence of questions can be limiting, which is where the fishbone diagram, or Ishikawa, becomes necessary. This visual framework forces us to categorize cause and effect relationships across various domains, such as people, processes, technology, and environment. Imagine we are analyzing why a specific product launch failed to meet market adoption targets. We draw a spine on our board and create branches for each category. Under the process branch, we might identify poor communication workflows. Under technology, we might list insufficient platform performance. By distributing our analysis across these different vectors, we prevent ourselves from getting trapped in a singular mindset or blaming a single department for a complex failure. Once we have gathered a list of potential causes, we need to prioritize where to focus our limited time and resources. This is where the Pareto chart provides an essential empirical constraint on our investigative process. Named after Vilfredo Pareto, this principle suggests that roughly 80% of consequences come from 20% of causes. By plotting our identified issues on a bar chart in descending order of frequency or cost, we can quickly see which failures are consuming the vast majority of our operational capacity. If your chart indicates that most customer complaints stem from a single legacy module, you know exactly where to apply your rigorous analysis. It prevents the common trap of spending 80% of your effort fixing the infrequent nuisances that define the tail end of your data. Applying these tools effectively requires a degree of detachment from the emotional weight of a project failure. It is common to encounter resistance when you start digging, as people often feel threatened when processes they own are brought under scientific scrutiny. You must frame the root cause analysis not as a finger-pointing exercise, but as a deliberate effort to strengthen the organization's strategic foundation. By maintaining a neutral, inquisitive stance, you allow the facts to emerge from the data rather than letting the loudest voice in the room dictate the cause. When you present your findings backed by a 5 whys chain or a Pareto distribution, you move the conversation from opinion to evidence, which is the only way to gain buy-in for systemic changes. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the structure of a business case and how to build a compelling justification for project investment. A business case functions as the foundation for any significant organizational investment, acting as a structured argument that justifies the allocation of capital and resources. Rather than being a mere administrative document, it serves as a decision support tool that bridges the gap between a business need and the proposed solution. When you craft a business case, you are effectively articulating why the organization should commit to a specific trajectory over alternative options. The clarity of your document often determines whether a project receives the green light from steering committees or faces indefinite postponement. Consequently, your objective is to translate abstract business goals into tangible metrics that stakeholders can evaluate with confidence. By standardizing this structure, you reduce ambiguity and ensure that the decision makers have a comprehensive view of the landscape before they sign off on a budget. At the heart of the business case lies the cost-benefit analysis, which serves as the primary mechanism for financial justification. You must meticulously document both the direct costs, such as technology, licensing, and human resources, and the indirect costs associated with operational disruption or training. On the other side of the ledger, you quantify the projected benefits, which are typically categorized as tangible savings or strategic gains. While tangible benefits are easier to calculate, such as reduction in manual labor hours, intangible benefits, like improved brand reputation, still deserve a place in your narrative. You need to remain objective here, avoiding the temptation to inflate projected returns to make the project look more appealing. A high-quality analysis provides a realistic view of the fiscal reality, which ultimately builds more trust with your finance partners and budget holders. Once you have established the costs and benefits, you must project the return on investment to provide a clear financial outlook. This involves selecting an appropriate time horizon, usually 3 to 5 years, over which you expect the investment to pay for itself. You should also consider the payback period, which tells the steering committee exactly when the project will move from a cash outflow state to a value generation state. Even if the numbers look promising, you're obligated to perform a rigorous risk assessment to identify what could derail the initiative. This process is not about finding reasons to kill the project, but about identifying potential points of failure so that mitigation strategies can be defined in advance. By explicitly stating your assumptions and the associated risks, you demonstrate a level of professionalism that warns stakeholders you are planning for reality, not for a best-case scenario. Resource requirements constitute another pillar of a well-structured business case that is frequently underestimated. You need to be explicit about the specific skills, technologies, and infrastructure necessary to execute the strategy, as these represent real-world constraints. Failing to account for the actual headcount required to deliver the project often leads to failure, as you end up asking teams to perform the work on top of their business-as-usual responsibilities. Map out the dependencies between these resources and the project timeline so that the steering committee understands the trade-offs involved. This transparency allows management to approve the project with the full knowledge of what is being asked of the organization. When you frame your resource ask in the context of project success, it becomes a strategic conversation rather than a simple request for more headcount. The final piece of the puzzle is your ability to articulate the value proposition to your steering committee. A steering committee rarely makes decisions based solely on spreadsheets. They look for alignment with the broader business strategy and the long-term vision of the company. You should draft your summary with these individuals in mind, focusing on how the initiative solves a painful problem or exploits a unique competitive opportunity. Avoid overwhelming them with technical jargon, and instead focus on the high-level outcomes that directly move the needle for the business. Frame your argument around the cost of inaction, highlighting the risks or missed opportunities that will persist if the project does not move forward. By connecting your specific project to the organization's strategic objectives, you make it significantly easier for leaders to view the investment as a necessity rather than an optional expense. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter on stakeholder management, where we will establish the fundamental processes for identifying everyone who possesses a stake in your project's success. By the end of these lessons, you will have a robust framework for mapping, categorizing, and engaging your stakeholders effectively. Identifying key stakeholders is perhaps the most critical activity you will perform as a business analyst, yet it is frequently misunderstood as a simple brainstorming exercise. When we speak about stakeholders, we're looking for any individual, group, or organization that can affect or be affected by the outcome of the project. If you fail to identify a critical group early on, you invite the risk of discovering hidden requirements halfway through implementation, which is often when change becomes prohibitively expensive. You should start this process by analyzing the project charter and reviewing the organization's chart, as these formal documents often reveal the primary project sponsors and the operational managers. Beyond formal structures, you need to look at the informal networks within the company to understand who holds real influence over business processes. Failing to account for someone who has the power to veto your solution, regardless of their official job title, is a common path to failure in complex environments. Your goal is to move beyond the obvious players and create an inclusive list that covers the entire spectrum of organizational impact. Once you have generated your initial list, the next logical step is categorizing these individuals into distinct groups based on their relationship to the solution. The project sponsor is your primary source of authority and funding, and they are responsible for the project's strategic alignment, meaning you must keep them focused on high-level outcomes rather than technical minutiae. Contrast this with end users, for whom you're designing the specific functionality. They live within the daily reality of the pain points you're trying to solve. You must also distinguish subject matter experts, who provide the granular domain knowledge you lack, from regulators who possess the power to mandate compliance or halt your progress entirely. Each group has a unique perspective, and your ability to categorize them allows you to customize your interaction style. Neglecting the specialized needs of regulators often leads to compliance gaps, while ignoring the operational reality of end users leads to a technically sound system that no one wants to use. By assigning everyone to these categories, you effectively delineate the boundaries of your investigation and ensure that your communication strategy is targeted and meaningful. The complexity of these relationships requires you to move beyond simple spreadsheets and start thinking about the roles and responsibilities associated with each identified party. Understanding that a sponsor cares about return on investment, while an end user cares about workflow efficiency, allows you to frame your requirements gathering sessions appropriately. When you engage with these stakeholders, you're not merely gathering a wish list. You're gathering context that informs the technical and strategic direction of the project. If you invite a subject matter expert to a session where you're discussing high-level strategy, you will likely waste their time and fail to secure the information you actually need. Similarly, do not expect an end user to have the authority to make decisions about organizational resource allocation. By clearly identifying the specific responsibilities of each group, you streamline your collaboration efforts and avoid the frustration of misaligned expectations. Always remember that your role as an analyst is to be a bridge, and you cannot build a bridge if you do not know which two banks you're trying to connect. When you consider the entire process, it becomes clear that identification is not a one-time event that occurs at the project kickoff. Organizations are dynamic, and project environments change, necessitating a continuous review of your stakeholder landscape to accommodate new influences or shifting power dynamics. You should revisit your stakeholder list whenever there is a scope change or a significant milestone, ensuring that you haven't overlooked someone who may have moved into a position of relevance. A methodical approach to this ensures that no critical voice remains silent when the design of the solution is still fluid. By maintaining this rigor, you protect the project from the classic trap of incomplete requirements, which often stems from a limited understanding of the people involved. It is easy to assume you know who matters, but the professional analyst relies on structured identification to prove the completeness of their research. This systematic approach forms the bedrock upon which all your subsequent requirements will be defined and validated. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of stakeholder management. Today, we turn our attention to the power and interest matrix, a foundational tool for navigating the human dynamics of complex projects. In any business change initiative, you will inevitably find that stakeholders possess differing levels of influence and concern regarding your project's outcome. If you treat everyone with the same level of engagement, you will quickly find yourself overwhelmed by administrative overhead while simultaneously failing to satisfy the people who actually have the power to veto your work. The power and interest matrix provides a structured, two-dimensional grid designed to simplify this complexity by mapping stakeholders based on their ability to affect the project and their level of interest in its success. By placing individuals into one of four distinct quadrants, you can begin to make objective decisions about how much time and communication resource to allocate to each person or group. This prevents the common trap of over-communicating with bystanders or, more dangerously, neglecting the high-stakes leaders whose support is essential for survival. It is not about playing politics in a manipulative sense, but rather about ensuring that you manage your limited bandwidth in a way that provides maximum value to the project's objectives. Systematic categorization allows you to move from reactive crisis management toward proactive stakeholder engagement. When you understand where someone sits on this grid, you can tailor your communication strategy to match their expectations rather than guessing what they might need. The first quadrant consists of individuals with high power and high interest, often referred to as the key players. These stakeholders are the ones you must manage closely because they have both the authority to make critical decisions and a vested interest in the result. You should engage these individuals through frequent, face-to-face interactions, ensuring they're consulted on major milestones and involved in steering decisions. Neglecting these individuals is the single fastest way to stall a project, as they are the primary drivers of organizational change and often hold the budget or the ultimate sign-off authority. It is your responsibility to keep them fully satisfied, as they are likely to scrutinize your progress metrics with high intensity. You should ensure that the information provided is nuanced, accurate, and highlights the alignment between the project progress and their own strategic goals. If you treat them as mere recipients of status emails, you miss an opportunity to build the coalition necessary for overcoming late-stage friction. Always remember that their interest is rarely purely altruistic. They want the project to succeed because it makes them look effective or solve a problem that currently plagues their department. Next, we address those who possess high power but demonstrate low interest in the specific details of your project. This category typically includes senior executives who have the capacity to stop your project in its tracks, but who are not involved in the day-to-day execution. Your goal here is to keep them satisfied without drowning them in unnecessary technical jargon, which they will likely find unhelpful or irritating. You should provide just enough information to demonstrate that the project remains aligned with broader corporate goals, keeping them comfortably assured that progress is being made. If you over-communicate with this group, they may begin to question the necessity of the project or start meddling in areas where they lack sufficient context. Instead, focus your reports on the high-level impact and risk management aspects, ensuring they feel confident that their strategic assets are being managed competently. When you do reach out, ensure the interaction is highly purposeful, brief, and focused on the results that matter to the organizational bottom line. By maintaining their trust while respecting their time, you ensure that they remain passive supporters rather than active obstacles. On the other end of the spectrum, we have stakeholders who show high interest but possess low power. These individuals are often the end users or the operational staff who feel the immediate pain that your project aims to resolve. They are frequently your most vocal supporters and can provide incredible insights into the functional requirements of your solution because they live the problems you're trying to fix. Even though they lack the authority to approve a budget or push a project through a committee, you must keep them adequately informed. If you ignore them, you invite frustration and silence, which can result in poor adoption rates once the final solution is implemented. Their input is invaluable during the requirements elicitation phase, and their buy-in will determine the long-term success of the post-deployment phase. By keeping them informed and soliciting their feedback on specific features, you make them feel part of the process, which in turn builds the user advocacy necessary for successful change management. Treat these stakeholders with respect and provide transparent updates, as their grassroots enthusiasm can often be leveraged to build momentum when a project encounters internal resistance. Finally, we encounter the quadrant of individuals with both low power and low interest. These stakeholders require little more than occasional monitoring to ensure that their position on the grid does not shift as the project matures. It is inefficient to allocate meaningful resources to managing these relationships, as they exert very little influence and express minimal concern about the project trajectory. Your focus here should be on providing a minimum level of general information, perhaps through newsletters or update bulletins that are already being circulated. Many analysts waste precious cycles trying to win over every possible skeptic, but this is a misuse of your professional capacity. As long as you maintain a professional baseline of transparency, there is no need for deep engagement or bespoke communication plans. However, you should periodically reconsider their position as organizational changes, such as restructures or new strategic directives, could move someone from this low-interest bucket into a high-interest one quite quickly. Be diligent, but not obsessive, keeping this group in the periphery while you prioritize the high-impact stakeholders who define the previous three quadrants. See you in the next session. Hello. Let us look at the structure of effective communication planning within the context of managing complex project environments. This chapter focuses on transforming how you disseminate information to ensure alignment and build lasting stakeholder trust. In any enterprise project, information is essentially a commodity that behaves according to supply and demand principles. If you provide too little, stakeholders feel isolated and prone to suspicion, which often leads to resistance or active obstruction. Conversely, if you overwhelm your audience with raw, unprocessed data, you diminish the value of your message through noise. An effective communication matrix serves as the structural backbone for your engagement strategy, defining precisely who receives information, what the content includes, the timing of the delivery, and the preferred channel. You should start by categorizing your stakeholders based on their functional influence and their specific informational needs. This prevents the common trap of treating all parties as a monolithic block, which invariably results in misaligned expectations. By formalizing this matrix, you remove guesswork from your daily routine and establish a predictable rhythm of reporting. This predictability acts as a psychological anchor for your stakeholders, allowing them to anticipate when they will hear from you and what level of detail they can expect in return. Consistency in this regard is not merely administrative. It is fundamental to maintaining a high degree of transparency throughout the project lifecycle. When we discuss the tactical components of this plan, clarity and brevity must take precedence over elaborate formatting. A senior executive, for instance, requires a high-level summary that focuses on milestones, risk exposure, and budgetary health, rather than a granular deep dive into development logs. If you force an executive to hunt for the core message within a wall of text, you have already failed your objective. Adopt a structure where the most critical information is presented first, followed by supporting context only if and when it is strictly necessary. Regarding the frequency of communication, you must balance the need for visibility with the reality of meeting fatigue. Frequent updates are useful when a project is in a volatile state, but they can quickly lead to disengagement if the content lacks substance or value. You should regularly audit your communication rhythm to determine if the cadence still fits the current pace of work. If you find yourself sending emails that are ignored or status meetings where attendees are visibly disengaged, it is a clear indicator that your frequency or medium needs recalibration toward more meaningful engagements. Managing stakeholder expectations is perhaps the most delicate aspect of the analyst's role, as it requires you to be honest about constraints while remaining solution-oriented. Transparency is not as simple as dumping all project data into a shared folder. It is about providing context that translates data into actionable knowledge. When a project hits a roadblock, your communication should immediately pivot to explaining the impact and the potential mitigation strategies already in motion. Stakeholders are generally willing to accept delays or shifts in scope if they understand the rationale and feel that you remain in control of the situation. Never use your communication channels to obfuscate failure, as this destroys trust permanently and makes future collaboration significantly harder. Instead, establish a culture where bad news is treated as a collaborative problem to solve rather than a personal failure to hide. If you build this foundation early, you'll find that stakeholders are far more likely to support you when you eventually need to negotiate trade-offs or request resources. Ultimately, your goal is to transition from being a reporter of facts to a trusted partner in a project's strategic mission. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore how to extract high-quality information through deliberate interviewing techniques and active listening. When we sit down with stakeholders, we are often tempted to treat the interaction as a simple exchange of information, where we pose a question and wait for a factual response. However, effective requirements gathering is rarely a linear process because the people we interview frequently struggle to articulate their actual needs. They often describe existing solutions rather than the underlying problems that necessitate those solutions in the first place. By mastering structured and semi-structured interviews, we move beyond surface-level chatter to uncover the core constraints that define a project's real scope. A structured interview follows a rigid script, which is excellent for maintaining consistency across multiple participants, whereas a semi-structured approach allows us to pivot when a participant reveals something unexpected. Integrating both methods ensures that you neither miss critical procedural details nor suppress valuable, unscripted insights that could fundamentally alter your project requirements. The foundation of any productive interview is the ability to formulate open-ended questions that discourage simple binary answers. If you ask a stakeholder whether they like a specific feature, you will likely receive a brief yes or no that provides virtually no actionable intelligence for your project. Instead, ask them to describe the challenges they face at specific times of the day or to walk you through a process that causes them frustration. The goal is to encourage the stakeholder to narrate their working life, which naturally leads them to identify the friction points they encounter. As they speak, you must resist the urge to jump in with your own assumptions or solutions. Your role is that of a neutral observer who is collecting raw, qualitative data that will eventually undergo the transformation into objective business requirements. When you shift the dynamic from interrogation to discovery, you create a psychological space where stakeholders feel comfortable exposing the gaps in their current tool set. Empathetic listening serves as the mechanism that bridges the gap between raw emotional feedback and the structured output required for formal documentation. When a user expresses frustration or annoyance, they're often signaling a breakdown in a technical process that has not yet been quantified. Your job is not to fix the emotion, but to listen for the specific technical or procedural trigger causing that response. For example, if a user complains that a report takes forever to generate, you should investigate the latency, the data volume, and the current system architecture. You translate the user's subjective experience of time into specific performance metrics that can be measured, tested, and documented. This objective quantification turns messy, emotional input into hard, verifiable requirements that developers and architects can actually build against later. Success depends on your ability to remain calm, stay curious, and continuously relate feedback back to the system's eventual business outcomes. Probing for hidden requirements is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the analyst role because it requires sensitivity to what is not being said. Stakeholders sometimes omit key details because they assume certain processes are common knowledge, or because they believe those tasks fall outside the scope of the new project. To uncover this, practice tactical repetition, where you rephrase what you have heard and ask if your interpretation aligns with their reality. If you suspect a deeper issue, ask them what would happen if a particular step in their process were removed or automated. Often, this line of questioning forces them to acknowledge hidden dependencies that they might have previously dismissed as trivial. By constantly challenging the status quo and asking for clarification on the whys rather than the whats, you reduce the likelihood of discovering critical functional gaps late in the development cycle. Being a great analyst means identifying these hidden pillars before the project foundation is set in stone. Ultimately, validating your assumptions during an interview prevents the downstream disaster of building the wrong software. Every time you synthesize a piece of information, you should present a version of that requirement back to the stakeholder to see if it resonates with their actual day-to-day operations. This feedback loop is essential because it corrects misunderstandings early, long before significant development time is invested in a flawed model. It requires a degree of humility to present your interpretation and admit that you might have missed a nuance. But this is exactly what builds trust and professional integrity. Your stakeholders will respect a professional who takes the time to verify that they are building the correct solution, rather than one who merely records the first thing they are told. By the time you conclude the interview, you should have not just a list of items, but a deeper understanding of the business problem that justifies the existence of the project. I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, We will explore the nuances of facilitating highly productive workshops and joint application design sessions. Facilitating a workshop is not merely about moving people into a room and asking for their opinions on a project. It requires a significant amount of upfront planning to ensure that the time spent by stakeholders actually yields actionable outcomes. You must begin by defining a clear purpose for the session, which serves as a guiding star that keeps the conversation moving in the right direction despite potential interruptions. The agenda should be granular, breaking down complex topics into distinct sessions that allow for focused discussion rather than broad, aimless rambling. When you set ground rules at the beginning, such as a requirement to stay on topic or a policy regarding mobile device usage, you establish authority over the environment. I often think of this as a form of architectural governance. You are providing the structure within which the creative problem solving can safely occur without collapsing into chaos. One of the most persistent challenges in any interactive workshop is managing the balance between outspoken participants and those who prefer to remain silent. Dominant personalities often believe they are providing valuable input, yet their dominance can stifle the very diversity of thought that the session was designed to capture. You might consider using techniques such as silent brainstorming or individual writing periods, where everyone records their ideas on paper before any verbal discussion takes place. This neutralizes the influence of the loudest voice in the room and forces the focus onto the ideas themselves rather than the persuasiveness of the speaker. For those who are naturally quiet, gentle prompts can act as a catalyst, but you should avoid putting them on the spot in a way that feels aggressive or exclusionary. The goal is to cultivate an environment of psychological safety where a developer, a stakeholder, or a business owner feels empowered to challenge an assumption without fear of immediate pushback. Time management remains perhaps the most strictly objective constraint in workshop facilitation, and it is here where many inexperienced analysts lose control. If you have allocated 20 minutes for a specific requirements elicitation task, you must be prepared to park discussions that drift into unexplored territory. Use a visual parking lot, such as a designated flip chart or a digital board, where you place tangential issues that are important but not relevant to the current objective. This acknowledges the validity of the participant's concern while maintaining your commitment to the schedule. You must also be keenly aware of the physical and mental exhaustion that sets in after a few hours of intensive work. Building in breaks is not a luxury, but a mandatory requirement for maintaining the quality of output. If the energy in the room starts to sag, the risk of bad design decisions or overlooked edge cases increases exponentially. Conflict in a workshop setting is usually inevitable, but it should be viewed as a signal of deep engagement rather than a breakdown of communication. When two stakeholders hold contradictory viewpoints regarding a business process, your role is to facilitate a search for the underlying requirement rather than deciding who is right. Ask probing questions that force them to articulate the business value of their respective positions, which often reveals that they were actually pursuing the same goal through different interpretations. If the disagreement persists, document it as a pending technical debt item or a dependency that requires further investigation by leadership. By transposing conflict into a neutral record, you lower the emotional temperature of the room and demonstrate that even if an immediate consensus was not achieved, the issue is not being ignored. This ensures that the collective buy-in you need for the final solution remains intact, even in the presence of legitimate disagreements. Effective facilitation demands a shift from being the active knowledge holder to becoming a neutral architect of the group's collective intelligence. You maintain integrity in the session by focusing on your process and your role as a bridge between the business need and the technical reality. If you find yourself drawn into the debate as a participant rather than a facilitator, you lose the ability to manage the dynamics of the session effectively. Keep your body language open, maintain eye contact with all participants, and strive to be the most objective person in the room at all times. Consistency in your facilitation style creates a rhythm that participants will eventually conform to, making the next session smoother than the first. By mastering these behavioral mechanics alongside the structural components of agenda setting, you position yourself as a true strategic partner within the organization. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the mechanisms required to manage conflict and reach consensus within complex organizational environments. Conflict is an inevitable byproduct of bringing stakeholders together to define requirements for a shared business objective. When departments operate in silos, their priorities naturally diverge, reflecting their specific goals rather than the enterprise's broader strategy. An effective business analyst must recognize that these disagreements are rarely about the features themselves, but rather about the underlying value drivers and resource constraints each department navigates. By surfacing these tensions early, you transform a potentially disruptive impasse into a constructive conversation about organizational intent. We do not aim to eliminate disagreement, as opposing viewpoints often reveal critical edge cases that, if ignored, would jeopardize the final solution architecture. Instead, our goal is to manage this friction through structured, objective, and transparent methodologies. To steer these conversations effectively, we utilize win-win modeling, a framework popularized by software engineering researchers like Barry Boehm. This model encourages all parties to identify their core needs and define win conditions that must be satisfied for the project to be considered a success. When you facilitate this, you position yourself as a neutral mediator, stripping away the adversarial nature that typically accompanies resource competition. You document these win conditions explicitly, focusing on the desired outcomes rather than the specific implementations requested by different factions. By aligning individual departmental goals with the overarching project mission, you move the conversation from my requirement versus yours to how do we collectively satisfy our constraints. This approach requires immense rigor in listening, ensuring that every stakeholder feels heard, even if their specific feature request is deprioritized in favor of a superior strategic alternative. When interests remain entrenched, shifting the focus to objective criteria acts as a powerful equalizer. Instead of leaving decisions to the loudest voice in the room or the highest-ranking executive, we define metrics upon which everyone can agree before discussing the dispute itself. These metrics might include cost-benefit ratios, compliance imperatives, or specific user engagement targets. When you facilitate a session built on these agreed-upon standards, you remove the personal element from the negotiation, making the eventual decision seem inevitable rather than dictated. It is often helpful to ask stakeholders to articulate their requirements in terms of the business value they generate, which provides the objective data required to compare different priorities. This shift from subjective preference to objective analysis prevents the trap of negotiating based on positions and forces the discussion toward interest-based resolution. Reaching consensus does not mean that every person is entirely happy with every decision. It means that everyone agrees enough to support the execution of the chosen path. This is known as the disagree and commit model, which is essential for maintaining momentum in long-term projects. To formalize this transition from deliberation to action, we require explicit, formal sign-off. Many analysts treat sign-offs as a bureaucratic formality, but they are actually a vital instrument of scope control. A formal agreement documents exactly what was decided, the criteria used to reach that decision, and the trade-offs that were accepted. When you archive these agreements, you create a point of reference that prevents stakeholders from attempting to re-argue settled points when the project hits inevitable development delays. This culture of documentation and transparency is your primary defense against scope creep. If a department attempts to modify requirements later in the cycle, you can return to the initial consensus documentation to assess the impact of their request against the previously accepted scope constraints. If the new request is genuinely necessary, it must then be subjected to the same formal validation process as the original requirements. This forces stakeholders to consider the cost of their changing demands, which naturally discourages frivolous scope expansion. By maintaining this steady, objective, and disciplined approach, you gain the trust of your stakeholders. They learn that while you may not always grant their specific request, you will always provide a balanced, evidence-based context that respects both their needs and the project's viability. I look forward to discussing the next steps in our workflow. Welcome back. We are starting a new chapter focused on gathering essential information. And in this lesson, we will explore the landscape of elicitation techniques. Elicitation is the foundational activity upon which all subsequent business analysis rests, as you cannot build a solution if you do not understand the problem. The core objective here is to extract information from the environment and the stakeholders to form a clear picture of what the system must achieve. We often view these techniques as a toolbox where the selection of the right tool depends entirely on the specific context of the project. If you're dealing with a widely distributed user base, you might reach for quantitative methods, whereas a bespoke or complex workflow often demands qualitative investigation. Choosing indiscriminately is a recipe for incomplete requirements, so we must develop the analytical rigor to match the technique to the constraints of the project at hand. Surveys provide a structured and efficient way to gather data from a large number of stakeholders, but they suffer from a rigid format that prevents follow-up questions in real time. When we construct a survey, we assume we know the right questions to ask, which is a dangerous assumption if the problem domain remains poorly defined. Conversely, document analysis is an excellent way to baseline existing knowledge without imposing on the time of busy SMEs by reviewing manuals, legacy reports, and policy guidelines. This method is essentially historical research, providing the context that experts might omit because they assume everyone already knows how the current process functions. It is a quiet, non-intrusive way to establish a common language before you initiate more direct communication with the stakeholders. Observation, or shadowing, allows you to witness the work as it happens rather than how someone remembers it happening or how they believe it should happen in an ideal scenario. This technique is invaluable for identifying tacit knowledge, which is the sort of expertise people have, but are unable to articulate explicitly during an interview. By sitting with a user and watching their interactions with existing systems and people, you notice the workarounds and the pain points that never make it into formal meeting notes. However, you must manage your presence to avoid the Hawthorne effect, where the mere act of being watched causes employees to change their behavior. If you remain passive and disciplined in your observation, you gain a perspective on usage patterns that would otherwise remain hidden behind layers of abstraction. Prototyping serves as an iterative bridge between the abstract desire for a system and the concrete implementation of one, making it a powerful elicitation tool. By putting a physical model or a wireframe in front of users, you force a tangible response that helps uncover requirements that were not previously articulated. Users often do not know what they want until they see a version of what they definitively do not want, making prototypes an excellent catalyst for constructive feedback. This method forces both you and the client to engage with the reality of the interface, revealing limitations or flow issues that were obscured by static requirement lists. It effectively shifts the conversation from theoretical needs to practical utility, ensuring that the alignment between strategy and solution is verified early in the life cycle. No single technique is a silver bullet, and skilled analysts often use methodology triangulation to ensure the integrity of the information they collect. Triangulation involves comparing findings from different sources, such as cross-referencing document analysis results with the observations gained from shadowing an employee in the field. When your document review tells you a process should take 5 minutes, but your observations see it taking 20 minutes due to a systemic bottleneck, you have identified a discrepancy that requires deeper investigation. This layering of methods acts as a safeguard against bias and incomplete understanding, providing a much higher degree of confidence in the final requirements. You are essentially building a composite view of the reality, using each method to validate the insights you have derived from the others. Everything you do from this point forward relies on the quality of these gathered requirements. So consider your selection of techniques to be a strategic decision. I will see you in the next part of our discussion. Welcome back to our exploration of requirements engineering techniques. Today we delve into the core of functional representation. When we draft requirements, we often find ourselves caught between the need for brevity and the requirement for precision. The classic user story template, structured as a persona, I want action, so that value serves as a conversational placeholder rather than a formal specification. I find this format particularly effective for maintaining a focus on the end user rather than the underlying system machinery. By forcing ourselves to articulate the value proposition in that final clause, we inadvertently smoke out features that add no measurable utility to the organizational goals. It is a simple construct, yet it prevents the common pitfall of building software that lacks a discernible purpose or a clear beneficiary. To ensure these stories maintain their integrity throughout the delivery lifecycle, we apply the INVEST criteria as a sanity check. An independent story allows for decoupled planning, ensuring the team doesn't get stuck in a state of dependency-induced paralysis. Negotiable stories allow for the inevitable emergence of new information during development, while valuable stories keep the focus on ROI rather than vanity features. Estimable stories rely on the team understanding the complexity involved. If you cannot estimate it, you likely don't understand the requirement well enough. Small stories are inherently easier to deliver and verify, while testable stories provide the objective standard for knowing when the work is actually complete. While user stories focus on the persona perspective, use cases offer a deeper, more structural look at how an actor interacts with a system to achieve a specific goal. Think of a use case as a contract of interaction where we detail the primary flow of events that leads to a successful outcome. We should not merely describe the interface, but rather the exchange of information and service that fulfills the actor's intent. When I design these, I start with the happy path because it defines the core utility of the functionality. By mapping the primary and alternate flows, we account for the inevitable deviation and error states that real-world users will trigger. Every actor, whether a human user or an external system, initiates a sequence that must be clearly delineated to avoid ambiguity. The use case description acts as a narrative guide, whereas the use case diagram serves as the high-level map of the system's boundary. If you ever find yourself sketching a diagram that lists every single button or minor interaction, you're likely digging too deep. Keep the diagram focused on the distinct goals the system must facilitate. Identifying the primary flow is only the starting point, as the value of the practice lies in identifying the alternate sequences. These paths cover input validation failures, system errors, or conditional logic that might alter the course of the business process. If a user intends to finalize a transaction, the primary flow assumes success. But consider what happens when a credit card payment is declined due to insufficient funds. This is where an alternate flow becomes part of the specification, ensuring the system manages the exception gracefully rather than breaking. I have seen many projects derail because they treat these edge cases as an afterthought or a bug rather than a formal requirement. By rigorously documenting these pathways, we move away from guesswork and provide the development team with a deterministic logic map. This approach doesn't just help the coders. It helps the analysts clarify the scope and identify missing functionality before the first line of code is written. Mastering both user stories and use cases gives you a powerful dual-lens perspective. You use stories to drive the conversation and prioritization, and you use cases to codify the logic and behavioral expectations of the solution. They are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary tools that belong in every analyst's toolkit. When we balance the human-centric desire of the story with the functional precision of the use case, we minimize the gap between stakeholder intent and the final delivered product. It is this systematic pursuit of clarity that distinguishes effective requirements gathering from simple note-taking. I look forward to our next session where we will apply these concepts further. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will master the art of visualizing business processes through standard flowcharts and the widely adopted business process model and notation. Process mapping serves as the bridge between abstract organizational goals and the tangible, day-to-day execution of work. When we translate a messy, real-world operation into a structured diagram, we gain the ability to analyze it with objective clarity. A well-constructed flowchart does not just document how things work today. It acts as a diagnostic tool that reveals hidden friction points. If you cannot describe your process as a sequence of deliberate steps, you cannot improve it. By using standard notations, we ensure that every stakeholder interprets the workflow in the exact same way, eliminating ambiguity. This disciplined approach is essential for any business analyst who intends to move beyond mere observation and into the realm of architectural design. We will focus on the mechanics of creating these maps so that they convey high-fidelity information rather than just serving as decorative slide content. One of the most effective ways to visualize these complex interactions is through the use of swim lane diagrams. These diagrams go beyond a simple sequence of events by explicitly defining who is responsible for each specific action. A swim lane diagram organizes the process flow by partitioning activities into parallel lanes, where each lane represents an actor, a role, or a specific department. When you observe a process through this lens, the handoffs between different entities become immediately visible. Often, the most significant delays in an organization occur precisely at these boundaries. If a document must move from the sales department to the legal team, the swim lane visualization will highlight if it sits dormant in an inbox. By mapping these handoffs, we can identify whether roles are clearly defined or if there is structural confusion that leads to duplicate work or stalled progress. Once a current state map is established, our attention must shift to identifying inefficiencies that impede organizational flow. I have found that simple observation is rarely enough. One must look for the distinct signatures of bottlenecking. A bottleneck occurs when the throughput of a sequential process is limited by a single step that lacks the required capacity or resources to handle the volume. You will often see this in a flowchart as a growing queue of tasks leading into a single, overloaded function. As analysts, our goal is to interrogate these points by asking why the process slows down at that specific juncture. Is the step inherently time-consuming, or is it starved of the information it needs from previous stages? By isolating these constraints, we can design a future state process that streamlines these interactions and redistributes the load. The transition from current state mapping to future state design is where an analyst adds the most value to an organization. We do not design for the sake of aesthetics, but for the sake of measurable operational efficiency. A future state model should represent the idealized version of the workflow where known friction points have been mitigated or eliminated entirely. We achieve this by experimenting with the path of the process, perhaps by introducing automation where human input is redundant, or by restructuring handoffs to reduce wait times. It is a form of engineering. We are optimizing a system of human and digital activity to reduce costs and increase output. When you present this future state to stakeholders, ensure that the improvements are explicitly linked to the bottlenecks identified in your earlier analysis. This evidence-based approach is what turns a theoretical model into a practical blueprint for business transformation. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this exploration of the fundamental distinction between what a system does and how it behaves under various conditions. In this session, we will clarify the boundary between functional and non-functional requirements to ensure your project scope remains precise and actionable. When we talk about functional requirements, we are essentially defining the contracts of behavior for the software. These requirements describe specific tasks, functions, or features that the system must support to satisfy user needs. Imagine an e-commerce platform. A functional requirement will be the user's ability to add an item to a shopping cart or to process a payment through a credit card gateway. These are the building blocks that allow the business to conduct its daily operations and deliver value to its customers. Without these defined behaviors, the software lacks a purpose, and users cannot achieve the goals they set out to accomplish. As a business analyst, you elicit these by asking what the system must do to support a business process. If a requirement describes an action, an outcome, or a state change triggered by a user or an external system, it is almost certainly a functional requirement. Conversely, non-functional requirements, often referred to as quality attributes or quality of service requirements, define the environmental constraints and performance standards of a solution. They do not describe what the system does, but rather how the system performs those tasks effectively and reliably. For instance, while a functional requirement states that the system must generate a monthly report, a non-functional requirement specifies that this report must be generated within 5 seconds for at least 1,000 concurrent users. These requirements encompass critical aspects such as security, usability, scalability, and performance, which are mandatory for systemic stability. If you ignore these, the system might function correctly in a lab environment, but fail catastrophically when deployed to thousands of concurrent users in a production setting. Business analysts must treat these with the same rigor as functional requirements, as they directly impact user satisfaction and system maintainability. Performance requirements represent how the system reacts under specific loads, often dictating the underlying infrastructure needs. Scalability is closely related to this, focusing on the system's ability to handle an increased volume of work without degradation of service. When defining these, you should avoid vague language like "the system should be fast" because that is subjective and impossible to test or measure. Instead, look for concrete thresholds such as latency benchmarks or throughput capacity measured in requests per second. Security requirements define how the system protects data, manages access control, and ensures auditability across the entire lifecycle of an information asset. By clearly defining these constraints, you allow developers to make informed architectural decisions that prevent technical debt later down the line. Usability is another dimension of non-functional requirements that focuses on the human experience of interacting with the system. It involves accessibility, learnability, and the efficiency of navigation for various user personas. While a system might possess all the necessary functional features, poor usability can lead to low adoption rates and increased support burdens for the organization. Organizations often codify these quality attributes into service-level agreements, which serve as formal, measurable contracts between the service provider and the customer. These agreements are fundamentally rooted in non-functional requirements because they define the expected uptime, response times, and support levels. If a requirement cannot be measured or validated during the testing phase, it is difficult to include it in a formal agreement, putting the business at risk of unmet expectations. Ensuring that your solution meets these broader organizational standards is a critical responsibility for any business analyst. You must evaluate how the non-functional requirements align with the company's strategic objectives, such as data privacy regulations or global expansion goals. If security is a major concern for the enterprise, then the non-functional requirements must dictate robust encryption and multi-factor authentication protocols regardless of the business features being implemented. Bridging the gap between user expectations and technical constraints requires constant negotiation and validation throughout the project lifecycle. Your goal is to create a technical solution that not only achieves the functional outcomes, but does so within the required quality, security, and performance parameters. By balancing these two types of requirements, you provide the structural integrity necessary for a successful implementation. I look forward to discussing the next topic when we meet again. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will focus on the foundational aspects of data modeling and its role in translating business operations into structured information systems. Data modeling is often mistaken for a purely technical activity reserved for database administrators, yet it remains one of the most critical responsibilities for a business analyst. When we build a conceptual data model, we are not concerned with SQL syntax, table constraints, or storage performance. Instead, we are mapping the vocabulary and rules of the business domain. The primary artifact we use here is the Entity Relationship Diagram, or ERD, which serves as a visual bridge between the complex realities of an enterprise and the systems designed to support them. An entity represents a significant object or concept that the business needs to track, such as a customer, an order, or a product. By identifying these entities early, you ensure that the proposed solution aligns with the actual movement and storage of data across your organization. Without this level of abstraction, stakeholders often find themselves reviewing technical specifications that they do not understand, leading to a disconnect in requirements validation. You must treat this model as a living document that captures the fundamental heartbeat of the business processes you have already mapped out during your elicitation phase. To build an effective conceptual model, you must systematically identify the attributes that define your entities and the relationships that connect them. An attribute is simply a specific piece of information that describes an entity, such as a date of birth for a customer or a unit price for a product. Choosing the right attributes is rarely about gathering everything possible. It is about gathering that which satisfies the business rules and reporting requirements. For instance, if the marketing department needs to calculate customer lifetime value, your entity model must explicitly support the association between a customer and their aggregate spend history. Relationships clarify how these entities interact, whether that interaction is one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many. A customer might place many orders, but an order typically belongs to only one customer, and capturing this cardinality is essential for downstream systems design. When these relationships are clearly defined, they validate whether your current business process flows are actually supported by the underlying information architecture. The value of this exercise lies in its ability to uncover hidden complexities that surface only when you begin to map the data. Business stakeholders often assume that everyone shares the same definition for core concepts. Yet a simple term like active user can have radically different meanings for the billing department compared to the customer support team. By visualizing these entities and their relationships, you force a consensus that acts as a guardrail against ambiguous requirements. This is where you identify the constraints that might break a planned workflow or the gaps where the current process fails to collect necessary data. If your business process requires an action to be taken on a shipment, but your conceptual data model cannot link the shipment to a valid carrier, you have successfully identified a requirement gap before a single line of code is written. You are essentially creating a technical blueprint that maintains the integrity of business logic while preparing developers to implement a robust, scalable system. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey through the analytical disciplines. In this section, we will examine formal prioritization frameworks to manage the inherent tension between high business ambition and finite project resources. Prioritization is rarely about choosing the easy path. It is fundamentally about the economic reality of trade-offs. When you elicit requirements from stakeholders, you will almost inevitably be presented with a list of features that all appear critical to the project's success. However, human perception of necessity is often decoupled from technical feasibility or budgetary reality. Without a standardized framework to inject objectivity into this process, the analyst is left mediating subjective arguments rather than facilitating business decisions. By adopting structured approaches, we shift the conversation from individual opinions to a shared understanding of risk and value. This transition is essential for any professional acting as a bridge between strategic business objectives and the realities of software construction. The Moscow method remains perhaps the most recognizable framework for categorizing requirements by urgency and necessity. We classify items into 4 buckets: must have, should have, could have, and want have, which provides a clear heuristic for team alignment. A must-have requirement is non-negotiable. If the system does not include it, the release is considered a failure. Should-have requirements are important, but not vital for an immediate launch, meaning they can be deferred without compromising the core utility of the product. Could-have represents a desirable feature set that adds value if resources permit, while won't-have implies a deliberate decision to exclude an item for the current horizon. Using these categories allows you to guide stakeholders toward a realistic baseline while maintaining flexibility for later iterations. When we shift our focus to user satisfaction, the Kano model offers a deeper perspective by mapping functionality against psychological impact. This model categorizes features into basic needs, performance features, and delighters, recognizing that user expectations are not static. Basic needs are those requirements that result in dissatisfaction if they are missing but go unnoticed when present, such as login functionality. Performance features operate linearly. The more you provide, the higher the satisfaction, such as processing speed or data storage capacity. Delighters are unexpected features that provide disproportionate satisfaction, but do not cause alarm if absent. By understanding this distinction, an analyst can prioritize high-performance features while avoiding the trap of overinvesting in attributes that no longer provide competitive differentiation. Balancing these prioritization frameworks requires a disciplined look at the intersection of business value, technical feasibility, and total cost of ownership. Value is not merely a revenue projection. It can represent efficiency gains, regulatory compliance, or reduced technical debt. Feasibility is the realm of the development team, and as analysts, we must respect the constraints they surface regarding architecture, dependencies, and delivery velocity. If a high-value requirement carries extreme technical complexity or cost, it may need to be decomposed or reprioritized against lower-hanging fruit. This cost-benefit analysis is the most taxing part of the role because it requires you to challenge stakeholders on their assumptions. You are not simply recording their wishes. You are quantifying the return on each incremental unit of effort invested. Stakeholder negotiation during this process often requires a blend of facilitation and firm boundary setting to ensure the project remains viable. In agile environments, the pressure to deliver is constant, and the risk of scope creep is significant when clear prioritization disappears. You must involve your stakeholders early and often to foster a shared sense of ownership over what gets included in each release. If you hold the power of prioritization solely in your own hands, you lose the crucial buy-in required when difficult cuts become necessary. Instead, use these frameworks to visualize the impact of decisions so that stakeholders can see the trade-offs in real time. This transparent approach protects both the team from burnout and the project from the erosion of its core value proposition. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we shift our focus toward the architectural integrity of our documentation by mastering the art of writing clear and effective business requirements. In this chapter, we will standardize the business requirements document to ensure your technical teams interpret your intent without friction. When we sit down to draft a requirement, clarity is our primary constraint. Much like selecting the right data structure influences the performance of a software system. A requirement must be atomic, meaning it conveys a single, discrete capability or constraint that can be implemented and tested in isolation. When you bundle multiple functional intents into one sentence, you create ambiguity that inevitably leads to technical debt downstream as developers struggle to decompose your logic. You should aim for a structure where one requirement equals one function, as this reduces the cognitive load for both the developer and the quality assurance engineer. If you find yourself using conjunctions like and, or, but, you're likely describing more than one requirement, and it is time to split them. This atomic nature is not merely a stylistic preference. It is a fundamental engineering principle that ensures your scope remains manageable and verifiable throughout the project lifecycle. Ambiguity often creeps into requirements when we rely on subjective language rather than precise definitions that leave no room for interpretation. Terms like fast, user-friendly, or efficient are fundamentally dangerous in a business requirement document because they are unmeasurable and lead to endless debates between stakeholders and developers. Instead of stating that a system must be fast, you should define a specific performance metric, such as requesting that the search results appear within 200 milliseconds under a load of 1,000 concurrent users. Achieving this precision requires you to translate fuzzy business desires into objective, observable evidence that anyone can see. You are not writing poetry, so leave the adjectives at the door and replace them with quantities, time frames, or specific state changes. When a developer reads your requirement, there should only be one possible way for them to build it, and that path should lead directly to the business value you promised. Consistency across your documentation is the third pillar of rigor, ensuring that terminology remains stable from the first page of your requirements document to the final sign-off. If you define a specific data object as a client in one section, using the term customer in a later paragraph creates unnecessary confusion and risks mapping errors. I recommend maintaining a simple glossary or a data dictionary to keep your domain vocabulary synchronized, especially when working on projects involving complex workflows. Consistency prevents the technical team from needing to guess whether the underlying data objects are distinct or identical, which is a common source of bugs in large-scale systems. You should also ensure that your formatting remains uniform, as erratic layout or inconsistent numbering systems make it difficult for stakeholders to navigate the document. By keeping your taxonomy stable, you provide a reliable foundation upon which the technical team can construct the proposed solution. Verifiability is the ultimate litmus test for any requirement, as a requirement that cannot be tested is, by definition, useless as a specification. Before finalizing any statement, ask yourself how a tester will prove that this specific requirement has been successfully implemented in the final product. If you cannot describe a specific set of inputs and expected outputs that demonstrate compliance, you have written an aspiration rather than a requirement. This mindset shift forces you to consider the end-of-life cycle for your documentation during its very creation, which is a hallmark of an experienced business analyst. A verifiable requirement serves as a contract between the business and the technical delivery team, creating a shared understanding of what constitutes a finished and successful delivery. When you focus on testability, you naturally discard the fluff, leaving behind only the essential logic that drives your technical solution forward. Communicating highly technical requirements to non-technical stakeholders, or vice versa, requires a strategic balance between accessibility and depth. You should avoid industry-specific jargon that excludes stakeholders from the conversation, yet you must not sacrifice the specific details required for developers to build the solution accurately. The trick is to use precise, domain-neutral language that focuses on the business intent and the observable outcome rather than the technical implementation. Instead of explaining how an API will sync at the architectural level, describe the business result, such as the inventory count being updated across all storefronts within 5 minutes of a purchase. This approach keeps stakeholders engaged without confusing them and provides developers with enough functional context to make smart design choices. Remember that your role is to translate business needs into technical reality without stripping away the nuance that makes the solution valuable to the organization. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we're going to explore the mechanics and the strategic necessity of the requirements traceability matrix. In its simplest form, a requirements traceability matrix is a document that maps and traces requirements with the test cases that verify them. It creates a bidirectional link between what the business asks for and what the technical team delivers, ensuring that no requirement is left behind or misunderstood. Think of it as a ledger for your project scope where every entry has a clear provenance and a defined destination. Without it, you are essentially navigating a complex development process blindfolded, hoping that your initial strategic vision eventually survives the transition into executable code. It provides the empirical evidence required to prove that the final solution aligns perfectly with the stated business drivers and stakeholder needs. When I look at professional project documentation, the matrix is often the primary diagnostic tool used to determine if a project is actually on track or merely busy. The construction of this matrix begins by identifying the source of each requirement, whether that comes from a strategic objective, a user story, or a specific stakeholder request. Each row in your matrix should represent a unique requirement, tagged with a unique identifier to prevent the ambiguity that usually creeps in during long development cycles. Once these are cataloged, you map them forward to the design documents, then to the code modules, and finally to the specific test scripts that validate their completion. Conversely, if you look at a test case and find that it does not correspond to a defined requirement, you have identified a potential symptom of gold plating. Gold plating refers to the introduction of features that were never requested by the stakeholders, which consume valuable budget and time while adding no tangible value to the business case. Maintaining this matrix is an ongoing activity that acts as a primary defense against scope creep and fragmented project delivery. When a change request arrives mid-cycle, the matrix allows you to perform an immediate impact analysis by highlighting exactly which requirements, design elements, and tests will be affected by the proposed alteration. If you're asked to change a functional requirement, you can instantly see which downstream components are coupled to it, allowing you to estimate the technical cost of that change with precision. This proactive approach saves hundreds of hours of debugging and rework because it forces the team to acknowledge the dependencies between components before any actual work is done. A well-constructed matrix tells a coherent story of the project, starting from the high-level business vision and ending at the successful validation of the final product. Effective analysts treat the traceability matrix as a living artifact rather than a static piece of bureaucracy that is checked off at the end of a milestone. It requires constant reconciliation, especially in agile environments where requirements frequently evolve in response to new information or changing market conditions. By keeping the matrix current, you ensure that the project team is always aligned with reality rather than an outdated baseline from the project inception. While it may feel like administrative overhead at first, the clarity it provides during audits and handovers is unparalleled. It removes the guesswork from requirement verification and gives you a defensible position when stakeholders question the validity of a sprint outcome. Ultimately, this instrument is about professional accountability and ensuring that the work actually performed is the work that was actually promised. See you in our next session. Welcome to our session on requirement verification and validation, where we explore the formal methods for ensuring our documentation is both accurate and fit for purpose. This chapter focuses on the transition from gathering information to confirming its integrity before development commences. In the domain of business analysis, we often conflate the concepts of verification and validation. Yet they serve distinct and equally vital roles in project success. Verification is essentially the internal process of checking whether the requirements have been developed in accordance with specified quality standards, constraints, and organizational rules. Think of this as the building the thing right phase where we examine the documentation for clarity, consistency, testability, and lack of ambiguity. If a requirement is contradictory or fails to follow predefined grammatical conventions, it fails the verification step regardless of how well it describes the underlying business need. We use techniques like peer reviews and inspections to systematically audit these documents against a checklist of quality attributes established early in the planning phase. By focusing on the structural and formal properties of the requirements, we prevent downstream defects that often arise from poorly articulated definitions. Validation, by contrast, is the outward-looking process of confirming that the documented requirements truly resolve the business problem and satisfy the stakeholders' genuine needs. This is the building the right thing phase where we test our interpretation of reality against the mental models of the end users and primary sponsors. A perfectly written requirement that describes a feature nobody needs is a failure of validation, even if it passes every verification check we can throw at it. To bridge this gap, we employ prototyping as a critical tool for grounding abstractions into tangible, interactive experiences. When a user interacts with a functional prototype or a set of low-fidelity wireframes, discrepancies between their expectations and our documented requirements become immediately apparent. This early feedback loop is far more cost-effective than discovering misalignment after a system has been fully implemented and deployed. Inspections and formal walkthroughs serve as the primary mechanisms for conducting these assessments, providing a structured approach to quality assurance. During a walkthrough, the author guides stakeholders and team members through the requirement set to ensure collective understanding and to solicit immediate concerns about the logic. An inspection is a more rigorous and disciplined examination, typically led by a moderator who follows a predefined process to uncover defects and omissions hidden within a text. By assembling a team composed of technical resources, business experts, and quality assurance leads, we create a diverse set of viewpoints that increase the likelihood of catching errors early. The goal is not to find fault with the author, but to leverage the collective intelligence of the team to produce documentation that is sufficiently robust. Maintaining this discipline ensures that we are not moving prematurely into technical implementation based on flawed assumptions. Prototyping serves as an essential bridge between the static documentation and the dynamic nature of user requirements, acting as a catalyst for communication. Whether we are dealing with high-fidelity clickable models or simple paper sketches, providing a visual artifact facilitates a level of discourse that written text often fails to achieve. When stakeholders see a representation of their request, they often identify nuances or forgotten criteria that were previously buried in their cognitive framing of the problem. This process effectively converts tacit knowledge into explicit feedback that we can then cycle back into our documentation. It is important to treat these prototypes as living documents that evolve alongside the requirements themselves as we converge on the final solution. By integrating this practice into our workflow, we align the project trajectory with the practical realities of the end-user environment, thereby minimizing the risk of building complex systems that ultimately sit on the shelf. The cumulative effect of these verification and validation techniques is a significantly lower rate of rework and a higher degree of stakeholder satisfaction throughout the project lifecycle. While the rigorous nature of inspections and prototyping can sometimes feel like an impediment to the rapid development cycle, the upfront investment pays dividends in the form of increased quality. It is far better to address a misunderstanding during an inspection session than to manage the fallout of a system that fails to perform its intended business function at the time of delivery. By institutionalizing these checks, you create a safety net that protects the project from the inherent complexities of human communication. Ultimately, your role as an analyst is to ensure that the technical team, the business owners, and the end users are operating from the same source of truth. Consistent application of these methods reinforces your credibility and demonstrates a commitment to delivering high-value outcomes. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back, and let us turn our attention to the rigorous discipline of managing change requests within a project lifecycle. We will discuss how to establish a formal control process and evaluate the impact of modifications on our established baselines. A formal change control process is not merely bureaucratic overhead, but a necessary mechanism to prevent scope creep from undermining your project objectives. When a stakeholder requests a modification, your first instinct should not be to accept or reject, but to place the request within a structured evaluation workflow. This begins with a standardized request form where the initiator must define the desired outcome and the perceived business value. Once received, you must log this request into a central repository to ensure total transparency throughout the life cycle of the project. By doing this, you create an audit trail that persists beyond the immediate conversation and provides clarity for all involved parties. This process mandates that no work begins until the change has been formally scrutinized against the existing project constraints. The core of managing these requests lies in a comprehensive impact assessment, which requires you to weigh the consequences against the triple constraint of scope, schedule, and budget. You must analytically determine how the proposed change affects existing functionality, as even seemingly minor modifications can cause regression in complex systems. It is prudent to consult with your technical leads to understand the depth of the work. Is this a simple interface change, or does it require refactoring the underlying data architecture? You should quantify the impact on the timeline by estimating the additional man-hours required and the subsequent shift in the release date. Similarly, you must calculate the budget variance, including potential costs for additional hardware, licenses, or external expertise. Presenting these hard facts to stakeholders transforms a subjective discussion into an objective decision-making process. Documentation serves as the lifeblood of effective change management, specifically through the maintenance of a detailed change log. This document represents the current state of truth regarding the project boundaries, capturing the requester, the rationale, the outcome of the impact assessment, and the final decision. When a change is approved, your traceability matrix must be updated to reflect how this new requirement links to existing business objectives and downstream technical elements. Approval is not a generic sign-off. It must come from the designated authorities who possess the fiscal and operational responsibility for the project. If a change is deemed necessary but too expensive, you might document it as a potential item for a future phase, thereby keeping the vision alive without compromising today's delivery. This rigorous approach replaces ambiguity with accountability, ensuring that at any given moment, the project state is defensible. Learning to decline a request with professionalism is arguably the most difficult aspect of a business analyst role. Many stakeholders view no as an adversarial response, but you must reframe it as a commitment to project integrity and existing delivery commitments. When you decline a request, you are actually protecting the quality of the work that remains to be delivered, as resources are a finite currency. If a request is valid but misaligned with current priorities, the correct response is often "not yet," which communicates that the team recognizes the value but cannot accommodate it without jeopardizing current objectives. This demonstrates that your interest lies in the long-term success of the organization rather than just immediate compliance. By providing the data-driven justification, the analysis of cost, risk, and timeline impact, you depersonalize the rejection and demonstrate your loyalty to the primary business strategy. I will see you in our next session. Welcome back to our exploration of the business analyst lifecycle. Today, we will examine the critical processes of solution evaluation and user acceptance testing. In any complex system, the delivery of software or a process change is merely the beginning of the journey toward actual value creation. We often fall into the trap of assuming that because a solution was built according to the specification, it is automatically successful. But this is a dangerous fallacy. Evaluation is not just a final checkbox in a project plan. It is a rigorous discipline of verifying that the implemented solution performs as expected in the real-world environment where stakeholders operate. We must bridge the gap between technical output and measurable business outcomes by systematically reviewing the performance of the delivered solution against the original business case. This requires a shift in mindset from construction to validation because a poorly evaluated system represents a missed opportunity rather than a completed task. Defining user acceptance testing criteria must begin long before the first line of code is written or the final process design is signed off. These criteria serve as the objective performance benchmarks that business users will employ to decide whether the solution is fit for their specific operational needs. When you create these criteria, you should map them directly to the requirements captured during the earlier elicitation phase so that every test case has a clear rationale. If a requirement cannot be translated into an observable, testable outcome, then the requirement itself is likely poorly defined or incomplete. By grounding UAT criteria in tangible business goals, you ensure that the testing phase focuses on the utility of the system rather than just its technical correctness. Facilitating UAT with business users is often more about managing expectations and fostering collaboration than it is about software mechanics. You should act as a mediator who helps users understand that their involvement is the primary defense against the delivery of unusable solutions. It is beneficial to set up structured walkthroughs where you guide participants through scenarios that mirror their daily tasks, allowing them to provide feedback in a low-pressure setting. Encourage them to document not just bugs, but also usability improvements or workflow frictions they encounter while interacting with the system. Your role here is to interpret their functional concerns into actionable insights that the development team can prioritize for refinement. Once the solution is live, the focus naturally shifts toward benefit realization, which is an ongoing process of tracking whether the initial business case is being validated in reality. Post-implementation reviews provide a formal venue to assess what went right, what went wrong, and how the actual project delivery compares to the initial predictions. You should analyze key performance indicators to see if the proposed improvements in efficiency, revenue, or cost savings have actually materialized. It is surprisingly common for a project to deliver the agreed-upon features while failing to achieve the strategic objectives, which often points back to misaligned assumptions made during the planning phase. Regular tracking allows you to identify these gaps early and propose corrective measures or adjustments to the operational strategy. A successful evaluation considers the nuance of human behavior within a system, recognizing that users often interpret and utilize tools in ways that were never explicitly defined in the documentation. We must maintain curiosity during the post-implementation phase, viewing every observation as a new piece of data that informs future strategy. If we find that stakeholders are bypassing certain features or finding workarounds, this is not necessarily a sign of failure, but a clear signal that the underlying process needs further refinement. By embracing this transparency, you evolve the role of the analyst from a simple requirements gathering clerk into a strategic partner who cares about the enduring viability of the solution. This disciplined approach to evaluation ensures that your projects yield lasting value rather than just a temporary spike in productivity. I look forward to our next session where we will continue building these competencies. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the analyst's role as a bridge during the final stages of a project's life cycle, specifically focusing on the transition into production and long-term maintenance. A business analyst acts as the primary conduit between IT developers and corporate management, ensuring that technical delivery aligns with strategic vision. While many believe the analyst's job concludes at the sign-off of requirements, the The reality is that the role is most critical during the handoff to production and support teams. You are responsible for ensuring that the systems being released into the wild are actually serviceable and understood by those who must support them. This requires a persistent focus on documentation, knowledge transfer, and the careful management of operational readiness. When developers finish their work, they often focus on stability and performance metrics, whereas management remains preoccupied with return on investment and business process integration. Your duty is to bridge these disparate perspectives so that the transition does not lead to operational degradation. By facilitating this communication, you prevent the common failure mode where a technically sound solution is rejected by business users because they lack the training or support to utilize it effectively. One of your most significant ongoing duties is translating technical constraints back to business leaders. Developers might state that a certain feature is impossible due to database architecture limitations or legacy security protocols, which can sound like a refusal to cooperate to a non-technical executive. If you simply parrot the technical denial, you invite frustration and a breakdown in trust. Instead, you must reframe the constraint as a business risk or a trade-off, allowing management to make informed decisions about budget and scope. Conversely, when business leaders demand rapid changes or shifts in priority during the deployment phase, you must interpret those needs for the technical team. You need to explain the business logic behind a request so that the architects can suggest the most efficient implementation paths. This ongoing translation work protects the developers from unreasonable expectations while ensuring that management feels their strategic concerns are respected and understood throughout the entire maintenance phase. Managing the handoff to production requires a methodical approach to knowledge transfer that goes beyond simple document delivery. You must facilitate sessions where the development team explains the system behavior to those in support, operations, and the help desk. If you treat this transition as an afterthought, you are effectively setting the support teams up for failure before the software even goes live. You should be looking for gaps where the support documentation fails to address real-world usage patterns that you identified during the elicitation phase. It is essential to ensure that the support team understands not just the features, but the business context, what the system is trying to achieve, and how users are expected to interact with it. During this phase, you are the guardian of the original business case, ensuring that the final configuration reflects the desired outcome rather than just the sum of the implemented features. Your presence during these handoff meetings serves as a quality control mechanism, ensuring that nothing is lost when the project moves from the construction phase into the day-to-day reality of corporate operations. Finally, you must continue to act as an evaluator throughout the maintenance phase, ensuring that the solution continues to provide value. Over time, the gap between what a system does and what the business needs can widen, even if the system remains technically reliable. You need to remain vigilant for technical drift, where the technical team might introduce changes that deviate from the business requirements or create new, unintended constraints. You facilitate this by maintaining a dialogue with stakeholders even after the project is considered complete. This creates a feedback loop where the technical debt incurred during a rush to production can be identified and prioritized for future remediation. By staying in the middle of these groups, you provide the stability needed to navigate the transition between active development and long-term support. You are essentially the organizational memory that prevents the lessons learned during development from being forgotten, which is a vital service in any complex technical organization. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this final session, we will synthesize the entire business analysis lifecycle, transitioning from strategic intent to the measurable success of delivered solutions. When we look back at the journey from initial discovery to final evaluation, the structural integrity of your approach remains the most vital component. You began by mastering strategic tools like SWOT analysis, which serves as a foundational lens through which to view organizational objectives and market positioning. Moving past simple data gathering, You learned how to construct a robust business requirement document that speaks both to the technical team and the executive board. Throughout the phases of stakeholder management, the power and interest matrix provided necessary clarity on how to direct your communication efforts effectively. Elicitation is not merely about asking questions, but about actively listening and facilitating consensus where competing interests might otherwise stall progress. By utilizing process mapping and prioritizing requirements, you transformed abstract business needs into actionable, testable specifications. Verification and validation ensure that the solution you deliver is not just technically sound, but precisely what the business requires to solve its core problems. Achieving long-term success in this field requires you to adopt a mindset of continuous professional improvement. You must stay proficient with the industry standard software ecosystem, specifically tools like Jira for issue tracking, Visio for rigorous process modeling, and Confluence for knowledge management. While certification exams validate your theoretical knowledge against standardized frameworks, your real-world value is proven through your personal portfolio. I advise you to document your experience by showcasing specific examples of complex requirements gathering rather than just listing job titles. Explain your strategic thinking process when you encountered ambiguous requirements and how you leveraged non-technical methodologies to bridge communication gaps. Employers are looking for analysts who understand that the technical implementation is only the final output of a deeper understanding of business strategy. If you demonstrate how you successfully align project outcomes with core enterprise goals, you will distinguish yourself from candidates who treat requirements gathering as a purely administrative task. Finally, carry with you the understanding that business analysis is as much an art of social engineering as it is a science of documentation. You are the diplomat who navigates the friction between those who define the vision and those who build the product. There will be moments of intense conflict and instances where stakeholders change their requirements mid-cycle, necessitating a firm grasp on change management and traceability. Keep your focus on the value outcome and remain curious about the underlying drivers of the organizations you serve. By applying the frameworks we have discussed, you provide stability in environments that are often characterized by volatility and uncertainty. Your career path will evolve as you gain more experience, but the core competencies of strategic inquiry and clear communication will serve as your constant bedrock. Success in this field is earned by consistently delivering clarity where others perceive only complexity. See you in the next phase of your professional growth.